Welcome back to CrimePod Castle's Twisted Love series, episode 31.
31 already. Wow.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Crazy. But today we're diving into a case that really gripped Kolkata back in 2018.
Oh, yeah.
You might remember it, the Kolkata Teacher Murder.
Yeah.
Sad story. Really reminds us how love can turn deadly, you know?
Absolutely. Sometimes the people closest to us, they have these hidden lives, and sometimes it can be devastating, the consequences.
Right. So Nandini Chatterjee.
Yeah.
She was 42, a teacher, very well-loved teacher, known for her warmth, her dedication, the impact she had on her students.
Mm-hmm.
But she was also navigating a complicated personal life.
She was. She was separated from her husband and living alone. And it was during this time that she became involved with a married man named Rajiv Mukherjee. These relationships, they often carry a lot of baggage, hidden emotions, unspoken expectations.
Right.
And it seems like those unspoken tensions really played a role in what happened.
So, forbidden love. Right. A situation ripe for things to go wrong. And they did. Nandini was found murdered, brutally murdered, in her apartment. What can you tell us about the crime scene itself? What stood out?
Oh, it was pretty disturbing. She had been stabbed multiple times, and the brutality of the attack, right away it suggests, a very personal motive.
Yeah.
The murder weapon was there at the scene. It was a kitchen knife from her apartment.
Oh, so not something planned, but more like something that escalated quickly.
Yeah.
Right, in the heat of the moment.
Possibly. The choice of weapon, something just right there, does suggest maybe a sudden outburst. But of course, investigators have to consider all angles.
Of course. And I imagine a weapon at the scene like that is really good forensic evidence.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And in this case, it was key. Rajiv's fingerprints on the knife.
Wow.
Directly linking him to the scene. So faced with that, and with witnesses placing him at her apartment that night, Rajiv, he confessed to the murder.
So he admitted to it. But what was his explanation? What led to such a violent act?
Well, in his confession, he said he went to her apartment to discuss their relationship.
Okay.
Said she was pressuring him for more commitment, maybe even to leave his wife, and it escalated into a big argument. He said, that he was overwhelmed, just this wave of rage, and he, grabbed the knife and attacked her.
It's like a crime of passion?
He was trying to frame it that way, a spontaneous act, fueled by emotion.
But did investigators buy that? People lie.
You're right. Even when they confess. And there were some details in this case that raised some red flags. For example, he initially tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong.
So even while admitting guilt, he was trying to kind of control the narrative.
Exactly. This attempt to stage the scene, deflect responsibility, suggests premeditation, which contradicts the whole, impulsive act thing.
Right. So even with the confession, things weren't adding up. And then there's the brutality, right? Multiple stab wounds, that's a lot of rage. What happened at the trial?
Well, the prosecution built a meticulous case, using forensics, witness accounts, his own words, and they painted a picture of a very calculated act, not just a crime of passion. They highlighted the fact that even while claiming to be overwhelmed, he still tried to cover his tracks.
Right.
First staging the scene as a robbery, only confessing when they had the evidence.
Yeah.
They argue, this showed that he was aware of his actions, deliberately tried to avoid responsibility. And then the brutality, the multiple wounds, they said that was evidence of intent, of a rage that was way beyond a momentary lapse.
So they were really pushing back against the crime of passion angle. What about the defense? What did they do?
Well, they had a difficult task. They acknowledged that it was a tragedy, but they tried to portray him as a man driven to a temporary but devastating, lapse in judgment. They argued that it was a spontaneous act, triggered by the pressure from both his wife and Nandini, emphasized his cooperation and his confession as signs of remorse.
So acknowledging the crime, but trying to get some leniency, I guess. What did the jury decide?
Guilty of murder. They didn't buy the defense's argument. The court, they acknowledged that it was complex, but ultimately, taking a life is a very serious offense, regardless of the circumstances.
Yeah, a guilty verdict. What was the sentence?
Life in prison. The court rejected any arguments for a reduced sentence. They said the severity of the crime, the brutality, the impact on her family and the community demanded justice.
Wow. Life in prison. So the crime of passion defense didn't work. What are your thoughts on the verdict? Do you think justice was served?
It's tough, isn't it? A life was taken, a family was devastated, you want justice. But these cases, especially the crimes of passion, they involve so many emotions, love, jealousy, betrayal. It's hard to really understand what led to this outcome.
Makes you think about the line between passion and obsession, right? And between a lapse in judgment and a violent act. This case really shows just how bad things can get when love turns toxic.
It does. It's a reminder that even with those strong emotions, we have a responsibility for what we do and a duty to find healthy ways to deal with difficult situations.
Yeah. It really makes you wonder, what if they communicated more? What if they talked openly, dealt with the conflict? Could this have been avoided?
It's hard to know. But communication is so important. And it's not just about saying what you need. It's about really listening, understanding the other person, maybe compromising, or even sometimes walking away.
This case really shows that love can be both a good and a bad force. But we have to manage our emotions, communicate, and get help if things get toxic.
Absolutely. Thinking about this case, it wasn't just some, story in the news. It really affected a lot of people.
Right, of course. I mean, Nandini, she's more than just a name, right? A beloved teacher, colleague, friend.
Absolutely. She was like the heart of that school, really
Yeah.
connected with her students, made them feel seen.
Yeah.
Parents trusted her. Her colleagues, they said she was always positive, always willing to help. So when she was murdered, it was just like shockwaves, this disbelief, this grief, that something so horrible could happen to someone who was so good.
It's just awful. And then there's Rajiv's wife, Aparna. We don't often hear about how these things affect them.
We don't. But her life was completely changed. Imagine you think you're building a life with someone and then you find out it's all been a lie, and then this violence on top of it.
Just unimaginable. How did she cope after the trial?
Well, it sounds like she was really strong. She divorced him pretty quickly after the conviction and focused on protecting her kids. Really says something about people, how they can rebuild after something like that.
And there's always hope, even in the dark times. But let's talk a little bit about something you mentioned before, crimes of passion. How do people in India view those?
It's complicated. In a lot of cultures, these crimes are seen as, I don't know, more understandable.
Like they're more excusable than other kinds of violence.
Yeah, like that. Like the idea of, being so overcome by love or jealousy that you just lose control.
But this case shows, even with those feelings, you're still responsible for what you do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And legally, India doesn't have a separate crime for crime of passion.
Okay.
But it comes up a lot, in defenses and how people talk about cases, especially when there's, infidelity, betrayal, that sort of thing.
So it's a societal debate too, right?
Yeah.
How we view love, betrayal, what's acceptable in relationships. Do you think this leniency, even if it's not official, makes these crimes more likely?
It's a good question. Some people say that, yeah, calling it a crime of passion minimizes how bad it is, and it creates this acceptance, especially in societies where men are often excused for, protecting their honor.
Yeah. Tough conversation to have, but we have to. Taking a life is serious. We can't excuse violence no matter what.
Absolutely. We need to understand the emotions, the culture, but in the end, people have to be accountable, no matter what they were feeling or what society tells them.
This case, it really highlights how important it is to be open in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
If Rajiv and Nandini had talked honestly, addressed their problems, maybe it wouldn't have happened.
Maybe. But communication is more than just, saying what you need. It's about listening, understanding the other person. Maybe you compromise. Maybe you even walk away.
Yeah. This case shows love can be good, but it can also be really dangerous. We have to control our emotions, communicate, and if things get bad, get help.
For sure.
It's really striking, As we go through all of this, it's clear that this case, it's not just about the crime itself. It's about people making choices, love going wrong, and then the terrible things that happen because of it.
Yeah. It's a real tragedy. And it affects so many people, not just those directly involved. It makes you think about the dark side of passion, how fragile connections can be.
And it raises those big questions, right? Personal responsibility, what society expects, how we communicate, especially when it comes to love and relationships.
Exactly. We've talked about everything that led up to it, the investigation, the trial, but I think it's good to step back for a second. What can we learn from this?
Right. The legal stuff is done, but this story, it still has an impact.
Absolutely. And one thing that sticks out to me is, the danger of letting emotions run wild. We like to think of passion as this powerful force, that it excuses bad decisions. But this case, it shows what can happen when there are no boundaries.
It's like we all need to know how to manage those feelings, recognize when jealousy or possessiveness gets out of control and find healthy ways to deal with it.
Yeah. And you mentioned societal expectations before. This case shows how we need to change some of those norms, the ones that allow for bad behavior, especially in those cultures where, men's violence is excused because they're protecting their honor or
Yeah.
whatever.
We need to talk about that more openly and honestly, about toxic masculinity, about respecting boundaries, and making it okay to ask for help when you're having problems in a relationship.
I agree, 100%. And looking at it more individually, this case really highlights how important communication is. Both Nandini and Rajiv, they had secrets. They weren't saying what they expected from each other. And that just made things worse.
Makes you think, right? If they had been honest, if they'd gotten help from friends, family, maybe a therapist, could it have ended differently?
It's impossible to know. But having those safe spaces in relationships where you can talk about your fears, your hopes, without being judged, that's so important.
And it's not just about talking, it's about truly listening, understanding what your partner is saying, what they need.
Yeah. Communication, it's the foundation of any relationship that works. And when it breaks down, that's when you see the really bad stuff happen.
This has been tough, honestly. Sadness, betrayal, actions you can't take back. But even so, I think there's something to learn here.
There is. I hope our listeners, they'll be more aware now of those red flags in relationships, how important it is to communicate and to have the courage to ask for help when you need it.
And more than anything, I hope they'll focus on building healthy relationships based on respect, empathy, and talking openly.
Well said. And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling, there is help out there. You're not alone.
This has been a hard conversation, but an important one. Thanks for joining us, as always, as we explored, what goes on in the human heart.
And the dark side, too.
If this deep dive got you thinking, be sure to follow and subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channel. We'll have more stories about crime, psychology, all that interesting stuff. Stay safe out there, everyone.